Good morning. My name is Megan Evans. I'm the Philanthropy Manager at Sydney Living Museums, and I thank you for joining us this morning for Reading the House Library, an exploration of SLM's rare book collections. I begin today by acknowledging the Camaragal people, traditional custodians of the land on which I am currently working from. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us. House museums have the unique quality of literally immersing visitors in the past, but it is not always easy to read what you see as you wander from room to room, and it takes considerable skill by organisations like Sydney Living Museums to interpret these rich but often foreign landscapes. An even greater challenge is grappling with the intangible history of a house museum. This might include the type of food people ate and how they ate it, what music they played and how they played it, what books did they read, what emotions did they experience, and how did they think. Today, Dr. Matthew Stevens will focus on the books in an historic house and will take you through some of the house library collections at SLM. This includes books that have been in the same house for over a century, as well as the ghost libraries that have been long since removed. Matthew is a research librarian at the Caroline Simpson Library and Research Collection. He is fascinated by early book and sheet music collections in New South Wales and the stories they tell. With a PhD in history from the University of New South Wales, Matthew's thesis, The Australian Museum Library, Its Formation, Function and Scientific Contribution, 1836 to 1917, includes studies of the personal libraries of early naturalists associated with the museum and its collections. Matthew has identified and written about the previously lost personal book collections of naturalists Ludwig Leichhardt and William Swainson, and he has worked extensively on the Mcclay family book collections formerly located at Elizabeth Bay House. Matthew leads the digitisation and interpretation of SLM's sheet music collections and is contributor and co-editor of the forthcoming book, Sound Heritage, Making Music Matter, in historic houses, published by Routledge. In 2019, Matthew curated the Songs of Home exhibition at the Museum of Sydney, which examined the musical landscape of New South Wales during the first 70 years of European settlement. Throughout the talk this morning, if you have any questions, please add them in the chat bar and we'll endeavour to answer as many as we can at the end. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Stevens.
Thanks, Megan. It's such a pleasure to be able to join you all today, and hopefully we'll all be able to get together in person soon. So I'll just share my presentation with everyone on the screen. Today I'll be talking to you about historic house libraries under the care of Sydney Living Museums and some of the interesting items and stories we've discovered along the way. I'm speaking to you from part of the Blue Mountains, which is located within the Ngurra, the country of the traditional owners, the Darug and the Gundungurra peoples. I acknowledge the traditional owners, past, present and future, who have a continuous and deep relationship with Ngurra. Well, I may be speaking to you today from the Blue Mountains in all its springtime glory. I spend most of my weekdays, during normal times, at the Caroline Simpson Library and Research Collection, or the CSL and RC. A specialist library, many of you may know, it supports the work of Sydney Living Museums in managing and interpreting places of cultural significance in New South Wales. The CSL and RC is the only public collection in Australia with a particular focus on the history of houses, interiors and gardens. In addition to collecting documentary formats such as pattern books, manufactured trade catalogues and pictures, we also collect material culture across a range of formats, including wallpapers, floor coverings, soft furnishings, furniture and hardware. We have combined this focus with our own scholarship and expertise, as well as the knowledge of SLM's wonderful curators. Over the years, the Caroline Simpson Library and Research Collection has contributed and often led the discussion in Australia about book and sheet music collections in historic houses. Acknowledging the growing interest in the history of book over the last couple of decades, we focused on developing a framework for scholarly interpretation of the extant historic book collections of the House museums within SLM's portfolio, including houses acquired by the Endangered Houses Fund. We have shared this through conference presentations, publications, exhibitions, and the ongoing development of a union catalogue of these collections through the CSL and RC's online catalogue. Research undertaken by the library team has identified historically significant material related to our properties hidden in a number of other New South Wales collections, and not only raised awareness about the importance of this material, but facilitated the transfer of some volumes back to their original home in our properties. In an article I wrote recently about house libraries for SLM's magazine Unlocked, I opened with this question: how often have you found yourself in someone's house perusing their bookshelves? Regardless of whether we read books on electronic devices or not, the habit of judging people by their books persists. Shelves of books in a living room or hallway are, paradoxically, not only public, can also be intensely private, revealing the inner workings of the minds of a household. Books in the homes of the past can be similarly useful for exploring a family's psychological makeup, but we need to apply different methods to understand what we see. Often the titles on the shelves are unknown to us. Most of the authors are a mystery, and once popular subject areas can look dull to the modern reader. While these libraries may seem difficult to interpret now, their very opaqueness underscores the ephemeral nature of our own popular culture. At Sydney Living Museums, our house libraries are represented in a variety of ways. We have collections still in situ within the place they were originally collected. Some house libraries consist of volumes returned to their original site after many years' absence. Others are simply the story of a long-lost library. The Carolyn Simpson Library and Research Collection also holds a number of remnant house libraries within its collection. I'd like to give you a quick overview of what you can find if you go hunting for house libraries at SLM in 2021. The library at Rouse Hill Estate is one of those rare examples of a collection that has survived in the original home in which it was formed. But even a library like this one contains the vestiges of multiple libraries. The books of family members and their friends often accumulate in a place with the strongest roots, and this seems to have been the case here. And it's perhaps not surprising, as the house was cared for by 6 generations of the same family, dating back to the first decade of the 19th century. There are over 2,500 print items in the house, and while spread throughout the building, most will be found in the schoolroom, the sitting room, and the main bedroom. There are books that were bought locally in Sydney, including literature, history, fashion, women's work, and theology. You'll find books with annotations reflecting their origins and family relationships. There are books and ephemera relating to the family's overseas travels, and school textbooks, often annotated and with the evidence of heavy use going back to the 1840s. Of particular interest are the family's receipt spike files that have survived from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and where you'll find receipts from booksellers and library subscription services. The library at Rouse Hill is by far the largest and most complicated of our collections, and to do it justice requires a whole session on its own. Like Rouse Hill Estate, the book collection at Marugal in Nowra reflects the life of its residents. In this case, it is the life of the Mackenzies, McGregors and Thorburns, and a family network dating back to the mid-19th century with Scottish origins. You will find almost 400 books, magazines and other reading materials which date from the late 18th century and up to the mid-20th century. Many of these items are associated with former residents of the house and show evidence of their use. This collection provides information about literary interests and trends, religious and cultural influences, and clues into the inner lives of the people of Marugal. The Mackenzies, like most Highlanders, were Gaelic speakers, struggling as shepherds and farm labourers following the decades of Highland clearances. Like many of their fellow Highlanders, they left Scotland in the 1830s, hoping for a better life in Australia. The family landed at Sydney in February 1839, and on the left of this slide, we can see a Gaelic Bible from Marugal, published at the time of the family's departure and owned by the patriarch, Thomas Mackenzie. Next to the Bible, you can see an undated copy of the Pilgrim's Progress. This was one of many copies in the house, according to a note left in a birthday book by Helen McGregor, born in 1883, who lived at the house while looking after her elderly aunts. Helen's note reveals a detailed audit of the copies of the publication she has located in the house. She says, "We have 4 or 5 copies of Pilgrim's Progress, one very ancient, but unfortunately some of the front is gone. There is at least one Gaelic Pilgrim's Progress, perhaps 2. Following further analysis of their contents, she concludes, "I love these old poems and also folk songs and old ballads. They are simple and direct and say what they mean in beautiful, simple language that reads like music." There are almost 50 volumes associated with Helen in the library at Marugal. The interpretation of Elizabeth Farm at Parramatta of John and Elizabeth MacArthur is in some ways the antithesis of Marugal or Rouseville Estate. The house is filled with reproduction furniture based on furnishings known to have been in the house. While the original library is no longer located in the house, an inventory of the house's contents was made in 1854, 4 years after the death of Elizabeth MacArthur, and gives us an idea of which books were still in the house at the time they were listed. Many of these volumes are now located at Camden Park, in what is one of the most beautiful examples of a surviving 19th century house library, although there has been a bit of dispersal. The book illustrated here is one example of a book listed on the Elizabeth Farm inventory. It sports the Camden Park bookplate, but is now in a private collection. Vorkluse House is another house that has lost its library, but some of the books Charles William Wentworth and his family owned are documented in an auction catalogue of 1900. We haven't done any work on this ghost library yet, and I'd be interested in any information people may have about Wentworth family book survivors. There are 2 house library collections in particular that I'd like to discuss in greater detail. I'm focusing on these collections because they have required the greatest attention and research over the last decade due to their particular circumstances. The first is Elizabeth Bay House, and the room illustrated here once held Australia's first great library collection. A magnificent natural history library amounting to thousands of volumes was brought here by the new Colonial Secretary of New South Wales, Alexander Mcclay, in 1826, and installed in this newly built room in 1839. Rather short-lived in its glory, it had always been believed that the original collection was dispersed in 1845 at auction. So until recently, the books held in the library were props, having no connection with the original contents of the room. Due to some hard work and a wonderful set of coincidences and collaborations, a small part of the original collection has surfaced, and I'll discuss this library a little later in my talk. The second collection is a library that is no longer cared for in its original location. In 2010, the magnificent homestead Throsby Park at Mossvale was transferred to Sydney Living Museums from the National Parks and Wildlife Service. At the time of the transfer, the house included a collection of remnant furniture, as well as 2 bookcases filled with books. The house has since been leased out, and its library is stored at the Carolyn Simpson Library and fully catalogued. The cataloguing of this collection enables us to explore the library in some detail and with some nice discoveries along the way. In addition to the properties I've mentioned, there are stories of books relating to Xana Place, Rose Seidler House, Hyde Park Barracks, the Museum of Sydney, and even the Mint. The question then becomes, when is the collection of books a house library, even if only a remnant? Is there a difference between a personal library, house library, and professional library in a house? How many books do you need to have? Is it 500, 100, or only 1? The Carolyn Simpson Library and Research Collection holds a number of personal libraries, in addition to the Throsby Park collection. Some of these are definitely house libraries, given their size, while others we might say are now only representative of a former library. In this image, you can see a collection of books from the Parliamentary Library of New South Wales being cleaned. Some years ago, we acquired over 1,000 volumes that were listed in the Parliament's 1857 catalogue. We have almost catalogued them all, and in the longer term, plan to marry these records with the Parliament's wonderful archive of receipts documenting the original purchase of these books. While not a domestic library per se, it is certainly a gentleman's library of the mid-19th century, and most significantly, the Parliamentary Library Committee consisted of people like Alexander Mcclay, William Charles Wentworth, and James MacArthur, all closely associated with our properties, and all houses missing their libraries. Other libraries in the CSL and RC include the Jones-Roberg collection, which belonged to the family of the well-known retailer David Jones. We have a small number of volumes from a property called Warawang, past Lithgow. These volumes were brought to Australia in the 1840s from Scotland, and while dispersed, the State Library of New South Wales has a great listing of the original library. We have a small number of volumes from the Berry and Wollstonecraft Business Library, but which later ended up at Alexander Berry's Coolangatta estate, and is an example of where part of a business library ends up in a house library. We even have a few volumes bought at an auction of the library of landscape designer Paul Sorensen. Before I focus on the collections of Throsby Park and Elizabeth Bay House, I'd like to touch on why we think the books in our house libraries are important at all. And what is it about these often highly outmoded, battered volumes that gets some of us so excited? You may be wondering why we should focus on these libraries, particularly libraries that no longer physically exist. Well, I've been fascinated by the history of books and libraries for a long time. I'm clearly not the only one. In fact, we are all constantly playing a part in the history of books and libraries, including the impacts of technological change. Here are some news stories over the last decade reflecting our grappling with this change. In 2010, there was a headline in the SMH, "E-books overtake hardcover sales, Amazon." Then in 2013, "Dump your Kindle, bookseller urges as Amazon targets Australia." And yet in 2019, print titles made up almost 2/3, 64% of all book formats published in Australia, while ebooks and other digital formats were only 17%. Technological shifts have affected the lives of many of us in a very short time, regardless of how many in the population are still reading print formats. Huge numbers of pre-digital books have now been digitised and put online. These sources include Google Books, HathiTrust, Internet Archive, as well as individual libraries, to name but a few. So when we're exploring books online, given that almost all the digital surrogates they contain have come from libraries in the US or Europe, one might ask what, if anything, do they have to do with the actual story of books in Australia? Here are two Internet Archive copies of A Guide to Domestic Medicine, which is a popular publication released in numerous editions. The content is fascinating, and the two copies represented here come from the Bodleian and the Smithsonian Museum libraries. The books were published in Britain and the United States. But what justification is there to relate these texts to life in Australia, if we wanted to? Here is a copy from the Throsby Park House Library, and indeed, there is a local story. This copy was given to Isabel Throsby, a young daughter of the house at the time of her marriage, clearly a health manual for her future as a family carer. We can see particular ailments underlined and what appear prices for medicines or other medical treatment. Clearly going local can have its advantages for us in terms of understanding our own history. The big change has been the growth in interest in the history of the book. All of the titles on this screen were published in the last couple of decades. As interest has moved beyond the book as purely textual, we see focus on the book as an artefact and its contribution to material culture. When we start to focus on bookseller labels, owners' bookplates or signatures, inscriptions on the end papers, marginal notes, and insertions such as bookmarks, letters, drawings, and pressed flowers, we can understand a book quite differently than if we simply talk about the book's printed text. One can even go further and ask questions about the binding, the paper, who manufactured them, who published the book, how was it distributed, retailed, and received by the readers. The list goes on, but how rich can that simple question be? Tell me about this book. I'll now turn to the House Library of Throsby Park and consider some of the tools available to help better understand how the surviving book collections may have been formed, used over time, and what meaning it may have held for the generations of Throsby who's lived with it. The original land grant for Throsby Park was made by Governor Macquarie to Dr. Charles Throsby in 1819. The estate was inherited by his nephew, Charles Throsby Jr. in 1828, and the current house constructed around 1834. Between 1868 and 1890, the house was leased out to tenants, but remained in Throsby family ownership until 1972, when it was purchased by the New South Wales Government and placed in the care of the National Parks and Wildlife Service. The house was transferred to the Historic Houses Trust, now Sydney Living Museums, in September 2010, and was restored and landscaped prior to leasing. When we first began examining the library of Throsby Park, one couldn't help but feel a sense of melancholy and abandonment when leafing through the battered volumes of this uninhabited house. In one of the titles, the Leicester Views, published in 1790, its author, John Throsby, and father of Dr. Charles Throsby, presciently captures his family's decline. The antiquarian writes of the pleasures of studying local history, the delights in tales of a more domestic nature. It places you at the birth of friends and neighbours and gently leads you to the silent tombs. It unfolds the roles of family attachment, family possessions and family distinctions. It leads you to the venerable pile of ruin, ivied with time and verging to destruction. An awful picture for declining years. As is so often the case with old families, these once wealthy landowners had gone into a slow decline and painfully parted with Throsby Park in the 1970s in the hope that government ownership would help keep the estate intact. This sense of the moribund is both inevitable and an enemy in a house museum too, and drives those who care for them to explore their collections in a variety of new and interesting ways. So these are the tools we have available to study Throsby Park's book collection. 530 volumes, some annotated, are now located at the Carolyn Simpson Library. An early bookcase, furniture inventories, a list of books made by a student at the Presbyterian Ladies' College, Pymble in 1967, oral histories and family history. There is no manuscript or printed catalogue, no family archive, no early picture of the interiors, and only limited bookseller evidence on the books themselves. Slim pickings indeed. Our first impression was that there was a broken library, probably the remnant of something larger and possibly finer. But was this view accurate? Here is a snapshot of its contents. The oldest book is a copy of Cicero's De Officiis, published in 1745, and the newest is Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, published exactly 200 years later. This is a predominantly mid to late 19th century library. It includes novels by Walter Scott, inevitably, Charles Reade, Charles Lever, Henry Hawley Smart, and Frederick Marryat. It also includes biography, natural history, art, travel, theology, lots of theology, reference works and school books. Books with known provenance are those belonging mainly to immediate members of the Throsby family, but also Dr. Patrick Hill, Judge Baron Field, and most surprisingly, Horace Walpole of Strawberry Hill near London. The Throsby family was very large. Charles Throsby Jr. and Betsy had 17 children, and Patrick Hill Throsby and his 2 wives had 12. This family tree reflects only some of the family members whose books have survived in the library. What has become obvious to us is that with each generation of owners came a new influx of books. There are surprisingly few books belonging to the 2 founders of the Australian Throsby dynasty, Dr. Charles Throsby and his nephew, Charles Throsby Jr. There is no evidence here of Dr. Charles' library from his home, Glenfield, and only 2 or 3 books that possibly belong to him. More perplexing is the lack of books signed by the builder of the homestead, Charles Throsby Jr. Even the book he signed do not mention Throsby Park. He appeared not to feel a need to mark his property in this way, unlike later generations. I suspect that a substantial number of the earlier unallocated books published between the 1820s and 50s, which are reference or multi-volume books, would have been ideal candidates for a new house library. One of these, the London Encyclopedia, published in the 1820s, is in its original subscriber boards, and the only other copy I've found in this state is in the Bodleian Library in England. All other copies have been rebound into a set of 22 volumes, and the subscribers on the boards and the publisher's advertisements are all lost. We know an identical copy was advertised in the Sydney Gazette in 1832, and this may well be the same set. We also know Charles Throsby Jr. was not only host and occasional specimen supplier to ornithologist John Gould, but that he had subscribed to Gould's Birds of Australia. Whether the family completed the subscription, I don't know, but there has certainly been no sign of the Gould publication at Throsby Park for at least 50 and probably 100 years, and is evidence that some of the library is missing. The main contribution to the library in these early years comes from Charles Throsby Jr.'s brother-in-law, Patrick Hill. An early Scottish immigrant to Australia, Dr. Hill held a number of senior medical positions and was a member of the Philosophical Society of Australasia in the 1820s, along with Dr. Charles Throsby. One wonders whether a volume at Throsby Park, once owned by Baron Field, who was also a member of the Society, found its way to the house via Dr. Throsby or Dr. Hill. Hill died in 1852, his wife Mary in 1857, and their books had arrived at Throsby Park by 1863. Most of the Patrick Hill signatures in his books have been signed by Mary, and it appears to have been the Throsby women who signed most of the end papers and title pages of the books for their husbands in the 1890s. And you can see here actually a letter that I found in Scotland, in fact, sent by Patrick Hill to his brother in Edinburgh. And you can see the writing there compared to the name Patrick Hill on the right, down the bottom. And that's in fact in Mary's handwriting. And on the left, we've got Patrick's real handwriting, which is quite different and very messy. It means that often you might see letters written by people that aren't written by those people. So you have to be really careful. The bulk of Hill's books are by Walter Scott, but a number of them were gifts from or are publications illustrated by his brother, David Octavius Hill, the Scottish artist and pioneering photographer. Some of the books have the label of Alexander Hill, bookseller, and were obtained from their father's bookshop in Edinburgh. There appears to be no surviving image of Patrick Hill, and certainly no photo, as he had left Scotland before his brother commenced taking photographs with Robert Adamson in the 1840s. Here are images of Patrick's brother, David, and Alexander, and you get the sense of what Patrick may have looked like. The salt prints produced by Hill and Adamson are not only rare and highly collectible, but also incredibly powerful. I can't tell you how often I've hoped a little photograph sent by David to his brother might fall out of one of Patrick's books one day, but to no avail. Patrick Hill's books make up approximately 10% of all the titles at Throsby Park. A further 10% of the collection belonged to Patrick Hill Throsby, son of Charles Throsby Jr., and who inherited Throsby Park on the death of his mother in 1891. It's a mixed bag of novels, some scientific works, exploration, biography, workbooks such as the Australian Magistrate and the Australian Stud Book, devotional works and school texts. All of these titles are marked with P.H. Throsby's name, some of which were owned by him prior to his move to the estate. Most, however, include the words Throsby Park in the annotation, and many are dated June 1891, the date he moved in. Patrick signed a Walter Scott novel, which had belonged to his mother, and a number of older works bearing his name and the 1891 date. This suggests some pre-existing books in the house were being signed by or for him. Why then did he not sign all the books in the library? Was it due to a lack of interest in some of the works, or a sense of trespass in his deceased parents' house? Following Patrick Hill's death, almost 50 titles arrived with the newly married couple, Frank and Jenny Throsby, in 1897. Frank was only 24 years old when he took over his father's house. A small number of the books belonged to Frank at school or had come from Jenny's family, but most are simply signed Throsby Park, 16th of January, 1897. A phalanx of novels in sets by Captain Hawley Smart, Charles Reade and Frederick Marriott filled the bookshelves. The young couple appear not to have signed their names in any of the pre-existing books of the house, but an oral history with his granddaughter, Jean Ostler, suggests that Frank liked his books. In his office, he had a large bookcase where he kept all his precious books, while the ones with all the Throsby history were kept locked in an 1820s cedar and red silk-fronted bookcase in the billiard room, which had been recently converted from the dining room. John Ostler was not the only grandchild to note the specialness of the old books in the house, and Del Throsby, the last of the Throsbys to inhabit the house, had remembered the bookcase in the billiard room back in the 1940s, filled with fascinating books. The right-hand picture here shows the 1820s bookcase previously mentioned. What then do we know about the arrangement of the books in the house? It is believed that the silk-pleated bookcase may have been made for Dr. Charles Throsby in the 1820s and used in his house at Glenfield. It's curious then that we may have his bookcase, but not many of his books. While this very attractive bookcase on the left looks very much at home and is of the right age and style, it is a red herring and a museum prop. It was acquired by National Parks at an auction in 1981 from the Badgery House sale at Exeter. Beyond the 1820s bookcase, we do not know where or how the library was stored in the early history of the house. There appears never to have been a room designed to be a library or called the library. An inventory of the house in 1894, made following the death of Patrick Hill Throsby, offers some clarity. The only two bookcases in the house and their books were located in a room called the smoking room. It was a relatively small room, and the inventory recorded a couch, easy chair, writing desk, picture on the wall, along with a pair of horns and a fox head for decoration. You get the picture. This was definitely a man's room. It is likely that it was the same room that was later known as the office by Frank Throsby's grandchildren in the early 20th century, which they described as having a desk, a place where his beautiful guns were stored, a freestanding bookcase, a built-in bookshelf, and Frank Throsby's precious books. Frank and Jeannie relocated the 1820s bookcase filled with the old Throsby books from the former smoking room into the dining room, and soon to be converted into a billiard room. The billiard room was the entertainment centre of the house for the adults, and the placement of the locked case of heirloom books alongside the family portraits appears to be making a definite statement. There is certainly evidence of the nurturing of a dynastic identity by the family through their books. The collection holds 2 works related to the history of Leicestershire by ancestor John Throsby, including a duplicate copy of one of them. There is no indication from where these books originated, but the original oil portrait of the author, which is likely to have been the model for the engraved frontispiece of the 1790s publication, has probably been hanging in the house since it was built. It is possible that these battered texts and the painting came out with Dr. Charles Throsby in 1802. The second copy of Select Views was purchased at the celebrated sale of the possessions of Horace Walpole of Strawberry Hill near London in 1842. The circumstances of this acquisition from the estate of the first Gothic novelist is not documented by Charles Throsby, the son of Charles Throsby Jr., travelled to London at the beginning of 1841 to commence his legal education, and perhaps this acquisition was the result of his visit. Almost 100 years later, in 1934, a grandson of Charles Throsby Jr., Dr. Herbert Throsby, proudly displayed the 3 volumes of Throsby's History of Leicester before the historical section of the British Medical Association, when presenting a paper on his illustrious ancestors. I've not mentioned marginalia or details of publishers and place of publication, but each can contribute more to the story of this library. It was never a grand library, and I doubt there was ever accommodation for many more books than the 530 volumes we hold now, but some of those books may have changed over time. It is very much a family library in the sense that many of the acquisitions are associated with the death of a member or the arrival of new members. Evidence of intergenerational interaction through text is limited, though a small number of books were signed by 2 generations of owners. The physical movement of the library in the 1890s and early 20th century suggests shifting relationships with these books, particularly the older Throsby collection. Although a library with limited documentation, there is enough contextual information, along with the books themselves, to trace some of its story. If there was one man who personified the power, passion, and utility of an extensive private book collection in New South Wales between the 1820s and 1840s, it was undoubtedly Alexander Mcclay. An examination of the content of Mcclay's library, reportedly more than 4,000 volumes when listed in an 1845 auction catalogue, reveals a depth and breadth of scientific literature rivaled by few, if any, individuals or institutions in Australia at that time. The existence of such a book collection in the colony during a period when homegrown publications were rare and access to overseas titles limited raises questions about how information was being shared by those interested in natural history. Like a church steeple in a small town, the size of Alexander Mcclay's library acts as a lightning rod to anyone interested in the early scientific book scene in New South Wales. He not only had the largest library, but was highly influential among those interested in local natural history. Mcclay's contemporaries knew about his library, and in 1836, John Lotsky noted that Mcclay's library was most probably, from its number and costly works, unrivaled in any other colony. Now, I'm certainly not the only person to have been interested in this library, and this is a little surprise, given that its tragic demise is such a rip-roaring story. But we have actually known very little about the collection, and most of what we do know is based on the catalogue published by auctioneer John Blackman in 1845. There are little scraps of information that have provided some light on Alexander's library. Prior to departing to Australia, Alexander Mcclay had been thanked for the use of his unrivaled cabinet and well-stored library in Kirby and Spencer's influential publication, An Introduction to Entomology, or Elements of the Natural History of Insects, published in 1822. Not long after the arrival of his family in Australia in January 1826, Fanny Mcclay reported in a letter to her brother, William Sharp Mcclay, that many of her father's books had been damaged in a deluge that had flooded the coach house in which the books were kept. She spent some time washing off the sandy stains from the books. By September 1839, the family had moved into Elizabeth Bay House. However, beset by financial problems, Alexander's affairs were increasingly managed by his son, William Sharp, and part of the strategy to save his father included the sale of his magnificent library. In April 1845, Mcclay's book collection, which included history, biography, natural history, political economy, divinity, and literature, was offered for auction by John Blackman. Alexander was distressed by the efforts of his son to save him from insolvency and became increasingly resentful. Such a sale of a gentleman's library was seen as the utmost humiliation. In March 1845, Elizabeth MacArthur observed, "The family of the Mcclays have broken up in an extraordinary and questionable manner. The best part of the furniture is sold and the library is advertised for sale. These extraordinary changes appall me." One of the things that intrigued me most about the collection is its disappearance. How can the dispersal of over 4,000 volumes be so utterly complete? Admittedly, the auction was 176 years ago, but I've seen enough provenance 18th and 19th century book material to know this is a little odd. Despite the very successful interpretation of the library in Elizabeth Bay House currently, Sydney Living Museums did not own one single volume that originated from that room. Until a few years ago, I had only ever seen one volume owned by Alexander Mcclay. It was Illiger's Prodromus Systematus Mammalium et Avium, published in 1811 and located in the Australian Museum Research Library. But even this volume was a mystery, as it was not listed in the original 1845 catalogue and had been donated to the library in 1926 by English scientist Tom Iredale. Extraordinary, there is no record of any member of the Mcclay family, many of whom are members of the Australian Museum Board, ever donating a book to the Australian Museum Library. A few years ago, I decided to get serious about Alexander Mcclay's missing library. My hobby was turning into an obsession. I asked a colleague of mine who was working at the State Library of New South Wales at the time, Tracy Gibbons, whether she'd like to join me on the journey. I expected the research to consist primarily of archival and library catalogue searches, combined with a physical examination of books held in a number of libraries. Here is a wonderful image of the library at Elizabeth Bay House in around 1935. This and other images of the built-in shelving raise some interesting questions. When were they built, and are they original to the construction of the house? Because the cedar shelving is ill-fitting and does not match the original joinery, it has been assumed that the shelves were built later, possibly by W.S. Mcclay. While this does seem a logical conclusion, as a librarian, I can't help but wonder where Alexander put his thousands of volumes when he moved into the house in 1839. These shelves really do seem the perfect solution. So what we can tell you about Alexander Mcclay's library since our research. As advertised in Blackman's catalogue, the library auction commenced on the 1st of April 1845. Surprisingly, correspondence reveals Alexander himself had a hand in the authorship of the catalogue, which seems curious for someone so resentful of the sale. It appears that he had not passively washed his hands of the process. Financial accounts of the sale, though brief, reveal that the auction was in fact halted for some weeks, and a newspaper ad stated that the auction had been postponed until gentlemen absent from the colony could return to take advantage of the sale. Perhaps the takings on the first day had been disappointing. In late April, the auction resumed and many lots appeared to be sold. The sale raised £567. The only copy of the catalogue to have survived in the Mitchell Library is unannotated, so it does not reveal what was purchased, for how much, or by whom. Immediately after the auction, John Blackman complained that he still had many books to sell and that given their high price, thought they would be hard to shift. He had sent catalogues to the gentlemen of the colony, but William Sharp Mcclay had returned his copy, so Blackman assumed he would be buying no more of his father's books. It was clear to us that not only had William Sharp Mcclay been purchasing material from Blackman, but it seemed likely that many unsold volumes were returned to Elizabeth Bay House and what was now William's new home. Many of Alexander's volumes not only stayed on the shelves at Elizabeth Bay House, but were added to with William Sharp's own significant book collection. On the death of William Sharp Mcclay in 1865, all his books and manuscripts were bequeathed to his brother, George Mcclay, and then begins the long tale of a convoluted dispersal. In short, a substantial number of Alexander and William's entomological books and insect specimens were left by George at the house in the care of his cousin, William John Mcclay, who was a tenant at the house. In 1874, the rest of the library was packed up and sent to George's home in England. In the same year, William John, who had also developed a strong interest in science, commenced discussions with the University of Sydney about donating William Sharp and Alexander's insect collections, in addition to a number of books. In 1887, the Mcclay Museum was completed. It was also in 1874 that William John accepted the founding presidency of the Linnaean Society of New South Wales and was its chief benefactor. He purchased a great many books for the Society's library, and in 1885 built accommodation for the Society in the grounds of Elizabeth Bay House. William John died in 1891 and left a large collection of his personal scientific library from Elizabeth Bay House to the Linnaean Society of New South Wales, along with a large financial bequest. This donation included books that had once belonged to Alexander and W.S. Mcclay. The Linnaean Society developed a significant scientific book collection over the next 90 years, but between the late 1970s and early 1990s, this collection was sadly dispersed. In late 2014, we identified 250 scientific volumes associated with Sir William John Mcclay among uncatalogued items held at Charles Sturt University Library, Wagga Wagga campus. These books had been acquired some decades earlier after the dispersal of the library of the Linnaean Society of New South Wales and were closely tied to the Elizabeth Bay House estate. The university kindly agreed to transfer the remnants of this significant collection to SLM, and they were conserved, cleaned, catalogued and returned to Elizabeth Bay House. In a final twist, at the same time as the Charles Sturt Uni transfer, the research team unexpectedly discovered that the Parliament of New South Wales had purchased over 80 volumes at the auction of Alexander Maclay's books in 1845. Sources in the parliamentary archives reveal a transaction that has long been forgotten, and librarians from the CSL&RC and the Parliamentary Library worked together to locate almost all the original Mcclay volumes purchased. In 2016, 40 volumes, once belonging to Alexander, consisting of Scottish histories and the political journal The Pamphleteer, was transferred from Parliament to the shelves of the library at Elizabeth Bay House after an absence of 171 years. And you can actually see here on the left the receipt for the books that were purchased from Blackman by the Parliament. And I don't think it wouldn't happen now, but the person who signed off the purchase was actually Alexander Mcclay as the chairman of the library committee. So he certainly had an interest and a conflict of interest. But I have to give his due. The books they purchased really did seem appropriate for a parliamentary library, and he wasn't sort of saving his natural history books and sticking them into the parliament where he could have further access. He did only buy books that seemed really appropriate. But it's a nice twist. It had become clear to us that the search for Alexander's library alone was impossible because it had been reabsorbed on a number of occasions by succeeding generations at Elizabeth Bay House and then gradually dispersed over the century. Interestingly, this is the only example I have found of a book representing the ownership of Alexander, William Sharp and William John Mcclay. It is exceedingly rare to see all three signs of ownership when often the family did not mark its books at all. To finish off, I'd like to show a variety of books we've discovered that were once housed at Elizabeth Bay House. These volumes are located in a number of different libraries now throughout Sydney. And I'll just quickly go through them. You can see here Alexander Maclay's signature on this book here by Pakel. And on the right there, you'll see an index that Alexander has constructed. This was very common for natural historians to create indexes of their books, and particularly highlighting particular species they might be interested in. We have here a book from the botanist Robert Brown, who was closely associated with the Mcclay family, and in fact courted one of the Mcclay daughters. And here it's a dedication from Brown to Mcclay. This is a really interesting find. It's a book by Francis Willoughby. It's actually at Fisher Library. at Sydney University, and it's his ornithology. And what's really wonderful about this book, it's signed by Alexander Mcclay. You can just see his signature there up in the top right-hand corner. But down below, you'll see a number, 208, which has been stuck on the spine. And this is, in fact, is the lot number from the Blackman catalogue. This is the only book we have found with a lot number stuck on it. But really, really a great find. Here again is very, very rare Prodromus lepidopterum britannicorum. And again, you can see Alexander Mcclay's scribblings all the way through there. A lot of these books are highly annotated and really interesting in terms of the study of science and how someone like Alexander Mcclay may be thinking as he works through his collection. Again, another book, Linnaeus, very, very important to all these scientists. And I've just highlighted a little a bookseller's stamp there, or a bookseller's label. And so we know this book was bought in the Strand in London, obviously before, probably, I assume, before they arrived in Australia. And again, more scribbling from Alexander. Very beautiful book. Many of the books have wonderful illustrations, as you can see here, lovely colour illustrations. And here we've also found some examples of William Sharp Mcclay's library. His library has no catalogue. Again, very significant. He was a really important naturalist in the 1820s and very significant until his particular theory that he espoused was trashed really by later natural historians, and Darwinism took over, and he's a footnote now in the history of natural history, but at the time was really significant. So it's really great to see some of his books, and his Encyclopedia Methodique. A lot of the encyclopedia, in fact, has survived, and he's got his London address stuck on the top. A very varied collection. He was interested in art, and he certainly was a good artist and drew. And there are books on his drawings as well. Again, a wonderful colour illustration here, very rare. More coloured books. They're so beautiful, a lot of these natural history books. And I'm just imagining this library filled with this material. It must have been the most spectacular place to visit. Again, these books belong to William John Mcclay, but also possibly Alexander and William Sharp. It's not signed by them, but it may have been in the library for a very long time when William John took over the collection. That's another wonderful image. So really, with the relocation of the Elizabeth Bay House Library of material belonging to Alexander Mcclay from Parliament and William John from Charles Sturt University, there's a new story to tell. For the first time, the majority of the books in the room constitute the remnant of what was one of Sydney's greatest house libraries. The collection represents 4 phases of the story of books at Elizabeth Bay: the libraries of Alexander, William Sharp, William John, and the Linnaean Society of New South Wales, as founded by William John. I think you'll agree that the stories of house libraries can be expansive and deep, and often it feels like we are only scratching the surface of what we can share here at City Living Museums through our book collections. Thank you very much. Hi, Megan.
Oh, thank you, Matthew. That was absolutely fascinating. If only we could be transported back in time to experience firsthand the Mcclay family library. Very much appreciated, and I'm sure, like many others on the webinar today, I'm sitting here trying to peek into your library behind you.
I can take you through if you like. No, I won't, don't worry.
Matthew, we're now going to attempt to answer some of the questions we've got in the chat bar. If we don't get to your question, please email Matthew at askacurator@slm.com.au. We have got the email address in the chat bar. So let's go to, oh, there's a few here. We've got one here from Jane Garling. Such an interesting talk, thank you. You mentioned the auction of the Wentworth Estate books. Is this catalogue online?
I don't think it is. We have it, it's in the State Library. We have lots of photographs, and I'd be really happy to share it, obviously, with anyone. It's a really important source actually to what was sort of left in the house at 1900. There was Wentworth furniture and paintings as well as books. So it's well worth looking at, and I can help with that.
Great, thank you. Kay Doug asks, is there any way we can see any of these wonderful pieces hands-on? of course, realizing that they are very fragile.
Yes, you can. Not at the very moment, but in a few weeks, definitely yes. Once we get past our lockdown, it varies a bit on which library you want to go to. Obviously, Throsby Park is an easy one because we have that at the current Simpson Library, so that's fully accessible. The Rouse Hill Estate Library, we can talk about. That's within the house in a very fragile environment. There are lots of catalogue records, but we can always, if someone's really interested in a particular item, there are definitely ways of seeing these books. Don't ever feel that you can't access them, but we just have to work out how we can do that because they are very fragile and they're still in their original site, which makes it more complicated. Elizabeth Bay House, yes, we could do that at the library, at the house, or we could bring some books back to, one or two books back to the current Simpson Library. So there are various ways that we can do this.
Thank you. Matthew, Ian Campbell asks, the books and libraries you talk in your talk discusses those of wealthy libraries. What were in the houses of the ordinary people?
That's a really good question. What we do have to remember is that while these are the wealthy libraries in Australia, what's really interesting is then when you look at, say, British libraries, and there are incredible examples of country house libraries, these amazing massive piles with these fantastic libraries, they're preserved. But in Britain, there are fewer examples of middle class or middle ranking libraries, which is really where our libraries sit if they were plonked in England. In Australia, of course, they're the elite, but they're not quite as high level as we might think they are when we look at the whole scheme of house libraries. But in terms of lower class houses, there's a nice example at Susanna Place. There are, in fact, some books that are associated with that house. And in fact, I write about them in an article, in that Unlocked article, which is online, and I think we're going to include the link to that. I do mention a story of a couple of books, or one book in particular, at the house. And those kids, they really only had one or two books. Really important to them, obviously, they're often reference books, but they also had access to the City of Sydney Library. So we're talking the 1930s, we're talking quite early. And so those kids are actually going to public libraries as well. So don't think that they don't have access to books in Sydney. It would be harder, obviously, if you're in the country, but there are other sources of books. There are, mechanics institutes. There are various places that books were available to people. But few of those books survive, really,
It's sad. Andrew asks, a wonderful presentation and narration, Matthew. Do you have a favourite house library collection at SLM?
It's a hard one. Well, you could say, is it the ones I've spent most blood and sweat and tears over? And that's probably Elizabeth Bay House, just because it's been amazing. And I know Throsby Park a lot better because we've had to move it. We've catalogued it, which is a wonderful thing. And Marugal is fully catalogued as well. So, and those records are available online. So that's, those libraries are important to me because I know them really well. Rouse Hill House is a gobsmacking library, and I don't know it as well, I have to admit. Our curators probably know that library better than I do. But I think that's a place one day that we need to do a lot of work and to really, it's got some great stuff. And because it's still in its site, it's so powerful. One little library I did mention earlier called the Warawang Collection. It's just a little handful of books. I think it's about 15 titles. And I feel quite emotionally attached to it because it belonged to a family past Lithgow, and the archive of this homestead, which is being rebuilt and is gone, now is in the State Library. So it's wonderful. It's the archive is there. A lot of it's sheet music, which is part of the reason I was interested in this building particularly, is in the State Library. And there's a list of their library, which was made a few decades ago, not that long ago. I went and visited the current owners of the family story, the Warawang, and some objects. And I went with Professor Ian Jack, a wonderful lover of books and a really important advocate of books, who only recently left us a couple of years ago now. Wonderful man. And he took me down there and we were just chatting about music, a beautiful piano we borrowed for an exhibition. And then I said, and what about the library? And she said, well, it was all in this garage. This whole room was full of the library until 2 years ago. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, we sold it at an orange bookshop. And we just sort of went, ah. And And so unfortunately, I went home and Ian went rushing off to Orange. He said, I want every book you've got of Warawang. Anyway, we had this little tiny box of about 15 or 20 titles, and they're little books. And so it's a very special remnant of a library gone, but it is fully listed at the State Library. So we do understand a bit about what it was like. So sometimes it's not the biggest libraries. It could just be a skerrick of a library, but it means a lot.
It means a lot. Katie asked, Matthew, you must sometimes feel like a detective rather than a research librarian. She'd be interested to know, what is the rarest book you've found in the collection?
Rarity is a really hard thing to describe because it might be, things are scarce, but not valued much. And also when we're talking about the history of the book and all the scribbles on the books, the marginalia, for me, that suddenly becomes part of the rarity as well. In the past, a book might have been important because of who owned it. And I would say that the Horace Walpole book actually is a really significant book. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the rarest, but it's a beautiful book because it was written by John Throsby, an ancestor of the people who owned the library. Horace Walpole was actually really rude about that publication. There are some little notes about him thinking it was not very good. Having said that, it's part of the very famous book sale in 1842, and not a lot of the books have survived. So in fact, at Yale University, they're creating a list of what books there are. The house is still there, and I showed a photograph of that magnificent library. It's an incredible house, but very few books have survived. So we've let Yale know that there's a copy of a book from Strawberry Hill, and so they've noted that as well. So it's part of a really interesting story about an important library and a really important figure in the history of bibliography. So for me, that one today. Tomorrow it'll be different.
Stay tuned. Ray's got an interesting question. What will home libraries look like in the future? Will they still exist?
I have to ask Ray. I don't know what Ray's, what does Ray do? I know, it's the really big question, isn't it? So yeah, I've got old books behind me. I do have a few books. They're not all old, they're newer books as well. I do read electronic books. I do read on, my partner really only reads new books, online books. So I can see it happening everywhere. I recently gave a talk about music and Spotify. How are we ever going to know what people listen to, what they did? And I don't know the answer to that. All I know is at the moment, lots of people are still reading physical books. I also know lots of people are getting rid of books. And anyone who works in libraries are really conscious of the distress, in fact, of descendants of book owners. They feel really weighed down by these collections because they're very emotional often. And it's really hard for librarians and libraries who often have to say no to collections. We don't always, but often we will. And so I don't know what the future will be. I really hope that there's going to be a way of us knowing how people read and what they read. We may not. It's something, but we may. We'll see what technology gives us.
The big question.
Yeah.
Matthew, Kiri Hill asked, have you found if any house libraries applied their own cataloguing or organising systems?
This is one of my big fascinations. In fact, what is behind me are quite a number of manuscript catalogues. How nerdy. I really like manuscript library catalogues, and there are hardly any in Australia. I know of one incredible one. It's in private hands, but there are very few that exist. And so, no. So we've obviously got the catalogue of the Elizabeth Bay House Library. That's an auction catalogue. So those do exist. So we get an idea of what might have been in a library. But it's a very different thing to someone actually listing their own library. I think looking at most of our books, there are no press marks. So that means that, often in a library, if they've created a catalogue, they'll say, okay, it's on the eastern wall, depending on how big your library is, on the eastern wall, Bay 3, bookshelf 4. And so you'll have these little numbers, and that gives you a clue. So the Alexander Mcclay books don't have those. I don't know how they found their books, but they might be alphabetically organised by subject. Who knows? So no. There's another list at Marugal of a few other little books. So you can see that they really like to list their books a bit, and they thought about their books and they organised their books. But none of our collections actually have catalogues. Yeah.
Interesting. So we're coming to the end of our time today, and I just wanted to point out that we have put some links into the chat bar for further information. If you miss those today, please email us at askacurator@slm.com.au, and we will be able to send them out to you. So Matthew, on behalf of all of us, thank you for sharing your immense knowledge and passion for early 19th century house libraries and the stories they tell. It's been absolutely fascinating. And to everyone, today's talk is just one of the unique benefits supporters of Sydney Living Museums can have access to. If you'd like to find out more about the many diverse opportunities available, please don't hesitate to email me at foundation@slm.com.au. Thank you again for your company this morning. And Matthew, a huge thank you, and I wish you all a great day.